The feed was still live when they grabbed her. I was standing on the observation deck of the Gallant Hawk, 200 kilometers above the surface of Athara Prime, watching the diplomatic broadcast on the main screen. Ambassador Lena Castillo was mid-sentence. She was reading from her trade proposal, the one she had spent 14 months drafting with input from every major Earth government. Her voice was steady. Her posture was perfect. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, and she was delivering it exactly the way she had planned. Then 4 tribunal guards walked onto the council floor and seized her by both arms. I felt the coffee cup slip from my hand. It hit the deck and shattered, and I did not look down. Every officer on the bridge turned toward the screen. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We just watched. High Arbiter Zithran rose from his seat at the center of the council dais. He was tall even by the standards of his species, with pale gray skin stretched tight over angular bones, and eyes like polished obsidian. He lifted one hand, and the chamber fell silent. Every delegate from every species sat frozen in their seats. Some of them looked confused, a few looked horrified. Most of them looked like they had known this was coming. Zithran spoke in that measured, deliberate tone that every diplomat in the galaxy had learned to dread. He said that humanity's expansion into the Velar Corridor constituted unlicensed territorial aggression. He said that under Article 9 of the Concord of 12, such aggression carried a mandatory sentence. He used the word sovereign. He used the word execution. He said them like he was reading a dinner menu. I was already moving. I crossed the observation deck in 4 strides and hit the comm panel hard enough to crack the housing. I opened a priority channel to the council spire and requested immediate access to the chamber floor. The request was denied before I finished speaking. I tried again. Denied. I tried a third time using my military override codes. A flat, synthetic voice told me that all human communications with the council had been suspended by order of the High Arbiter. They had planned this, every piece of it. The timing, the guards, the communication blackout. They had invited Lena to the chamber specifically to do this in front of the cameras, and they had left the broadcast running because they wanted us to see it. I turned back to the screen. Lena was on her knees. The guards had forced her down, one hand on each shoulder, pressing hard enough that I could see her wince. But she was not crying. She was not begging. She looked directly into the broadcast lens, and she started reciting her diplomatic credentials, her name, her rank, her authorization from the United Earth Coalition, her protected status under the Galactic Diplomatic Immunity Act. She listed every single one, clearly and calmly, as if daring them to acknowledge what they were about to violate. Zithran did not interrupt her. He let her finish. Then he nodded to the guard on her left. The guard raised his weapon. I want to tell you that I looked away. I want to tell you that I closed my eyes, or turned from the screen, or did anything other than stand there and watch. But I did not. I watched every second of it because I owed her that much. I had been her escort commander for 3 years. I had walked beside her through hostile ports and contested zones and backroom negotiations where every species at the table wanted something different, and none of them wanted peace. She had never once flinched. She had never once raised her voice. She had believed, truly and completely, that diplomacy was the answer to everything. The guard fired. The bridge of the Gallant Hawk went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heartbeat sound like a drum. I stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. I counted them because counting was the only thing keeping me from putting my fist through the screen. Then I moved. I walked to the command station and placed both hands flat on the console. My executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Grace Aldridge, was standing 2 meters to my left. Her face was white. Her hands were shaking. She looked at me like she was waiting for an order that would make sense of what we had just seen. I opened a sealed comm channel. This was not a standard military frequency. This was a line that connected directly to Earth's Defense Directorate, routed through 17 encrypted relay stations, and accessible only by officers holding protocol-level clearance. I had been given the codes 4 years ago, during a briefing that I had hoped would never matter. The briefing officer had told me that Protocol 7 was a last resort. He had told me that if I ever used it, everything would change. He had told me to be very sure. I was sure. I spoke one sentence into the channel. Activate Retaliation Protocol 7. My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble. I said it the way you say something that you have been preparing to say for years without knowing it. The verification ping came back in 11 seconds. Confirmed. Earth had received the footage. The protocol was live. I turned to Aldridge. She was still staring at me. I told her to set a course away from Athara Prime. Slow withdrawal, full sensor visibility. I wanted every scanning array in the system to see us leaving. I wanted them to track our engine signatures as we pulled back, nice and steady, like a ship with nowhere urgent to be. Aldridge asked me if we were retreating. I told her no. I told her we were giving them exactly enough time to understand what they had just done. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she turned to the helm and relayed the order. The gallant hawk began its withdrawal, and I stood on the bridge and watched Athara Prime shrink in the viewport. The planet looked peaceful from up here. Clean atmosphere, blue-green oceans, a ring of orbital stations glittering like jewels around the equator. It was the seat of galactic governance, the center of interstellar civilization, the place where 38 species came together to build something greater than themselves. And they had just used it to murder a woman who was trying to help them. I pulled up Lena's personnel file on my private terminal. Not the classified version, the personal one. The photo at the top showed her at her diplomatic certification ceremony. 6 years ago. She was smiling. Not a politician's smile, a real one. The kind of smile you have when you believe the work you are about to do matters. I closed the file and locked the terminal. The comm system chimed. Incoming message from the Council Spire, addressed to the gallant hawk. I read the header. It was a formal notice from the Office of the High Arbiter, informing us that our diplomatic clearance in Council space had been revoked, and ordering us to leave the system within 12 hours. 12 hours. They execute our ambassador, and then give us a deadline like we had overstayed a parking permit. I deleted the message without responding. Aldridge approached me again, quieter this time. She asked what Protocol 7 was. She had never heard of it. Most officers had not. It existed in a classification tier above top secret, accessible only to a handful of people in the entire human military structure. I told her the truth. Protocol 7 was not a weapon. It was not a battle plan. It was a sequence. A series of coordinated actions designed to be executed in precise order, each one building on the last, each one tightening the grip by exactly 1 degree. It was not about destruction. It was about making an enemy understand, slowly and completely, that they had made the worst decision in their civilization's history. Aldridge asked how many phases it had. I told her enough. She did not ask again. We cleared the Athara system 4 hours later. During those 4 hours, I walked the corridors of the gallant hawk and saw the same expression on every face I passed. It was not grief, not yet. Grief would come later, in private, behind closed doors. What I saw was something harder and more dangerous. It was the look of people who had been told that the galaxy was civilized, that the rules mattered, that diplomacy worked, and who had just watched those beliefs die on a broadcast screen alongside the woman who embodied them. Every crew member on this ship had served with Lena. Every one of them had walked past her in the corridor, shared a meal with her in the mess, heard her laugh at a joke during a briefing. She was not an abstraction to them. She was a person they knew, and the Council had killed her like she was nothing. I passed the ship's communications center and saw the junior officers staring at their screens. The execution footage was being replayed on every human news channel. Commentators were trying to find words for what had happened. Politicians were making statements. Military analysts were speculating about the response. None of them knew about Protocol 7. None of them knew that the response was already in motion. They would find out soon enough. As we crossed the outer boundary, I received a second confirmation from Earth. The Defense Directorate had convened an emergency session. The footage of Lena's execution had been broadcast to every human colony, outpost, and station in settled space. 2 billion people had watched it. The civilian response was exactly what you would expect. Grief, then rage, then a cold, focused demand for action that no government could ignore, even if it wanted to. The Defense Directorate had responded with a single public statement, 3 sentences. It said that the Galactic Council had committed an act of war against the human species. It said that Earth would respond. It said that the response had already begun. I read that statement twice. Then I went to my quarters, sat down at my desk, and opened the Protocol 7 operational file. The first page listed the phases in order. Each one had a name, a timeline, and a set of objectives. I read through them all, one by one, memorizing the details I would need for the hours ahead. 14 hours since Lena died. Phase 1 was about to begin. 48 hours after they killed Lena, I was sitting in a briefing room aboard the Gallant Hawk, staring at a holographic map of the galaxy that was slowly turning red. We had docked at Relay Station Kappa, a human military outpost on the edge of our controlled space. The station was built into an asteroid the size of a small moon, bristling with communication arrays and defense platforms. It was not a pretty place. It was a place you went when you needed to coordinate something large, fast, and quiet. Admiral Diane Kessler's face filled the screen on the far wall. She was broadcasting from Earth via quantum link, which meant there was no signal delay despite the distance. She looked like she had not slept since the execution. Her eyes were sharp, her jaw was set, and her voice carried the kind of controlled calm that only comes from decades of command experience. She told me that Protocol 7 was proceeding on schedule. Phase 1 had been initiated 6 hours after my confirmation code was received. It was already producing results. She pulled up the data, and I watched the numbers cascade across the screen. Phase 1 was called Economic Severance. The name was clinical. The effect was not. Every human-operated trade route servicing Council-affiliated species had been shut down simultaneously, not rerouted, not delayed, shut down. The cargo ships had been recalled to human ports. The fuel depots had gone dark. The logistics hubs that coordinated shipments across 12 major trade corridors had ceased all operations as of midnight the previous day. Every automated beacon that guided alien freighters through human-charted space had been switched off. Every refueling station that serviced non-human vessels had sealed its docking clamps. I studied the impact projections that Kessler laid out for me. The numbers were staggering. 40% of the Council's core economies depended on human-refined helium-3 for their energy grids. We had been mining and processing it for decades, quietly becoming the galaxy's primary supplier while the Council treated us like a junior partner. Without our supply, their power systems would begin degrading within 72 hours. Rolling blackouts would follow. Industrial output would drop. Within 2 weeks, entire planets would be rationing electricity. 60% of their long-haul navigation relied on human-built relay beacons to calculate safe hyperspace routes. We had designed and deployed those beacons because our engineers were better at it than anyone else in the galaxy, and the Council had been happy to let us do the work while they took the credit. Without those beacons, their ships could still travel, but the margin of error on every jump would increase by a factor of 8. Captains would start refusing to fly, insurance syndicates would start refusing to cover the voyages, trade would slow to a crawl. Within 6 hours of the shutdown, 17 species had reported shipping disruptions. By the 12-hour mark, the number had risen to 24. Within 24 hours, 3 species had declared agricultural emergencies because their food supply chains had completely collapsed. The Vorathi hegemony, one of the Council's founding members and one of Zithran's strongest supporters, had lost access to 90% of its imported grain reserves. Their population centers were 4 days from rationing. Their finance minister had issued a public statement calling the shutdown an act of economic warfare, which was technically accurate, but somewhat lacking in self-awareness given what they had done to trigger it. But food and fuel were only the beginning. Kessler walked me through the secondary impacts, the ones that would take longer to arrive, but would cut even deeper when they did. Human pharmaceutical compounds were the foundation of medical systems across 14 Council species. Our bioengineers had developed treatments for diseases that alien researchers had struggled with for generations, and those treatments required active human supply chains to manufacture and distribute. Without them, hospitals on a dozen worlds would begin running out of critical medications within a month. Human-designed water purification systems kept 3 species colony worlds habitable. Our software engineers maintained the operating systems that ran the banking networks for 8 major galactic economies. Our metallurgists produced alloys that no other species could replicate, alloys that were critical components in everything from starship hulls to atmospheric processors. The galaxy had been leaning on humanity for decades without realizing how far they were leaning. They had taken our contributions for granted, the same way you take gravity for granted, never thinking about it until it suddenly stops working. And now it had stopped. All of it. Simultaneously. Not because we wanted to cause suffering, but because the Council had made it impossible for us to continue cooperating with people who killed our representatives on camera and called it justice. Admiral Kessler showed me the Council's response. The Trade Directorate had convened an emergency session. They were arguing about tariff adjustments, emergency procurement contracts, and alternative supply routes. They were scrambling to find other sources for helium-3, which did not exist in sufficient quantities. They were trying to build their own relay beacons, which would take years. They were doing everything except the one thing that might have actually solved the problem, which was acknowledging what they had done and making it right. They were panicking about grain shipments. They were not talking about Lena. They were not talking about the woman they had murdered on their own chamber floor. The disconnect was so complete that it would have been funny if it were not so infuriating. I remember sitting back in my chair and feeling something cold settle in my chest. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too wild, too easily spent. This was something else. This was the feeling you get when you realize that the people who killed your friend are now worried about their profit margins, while her body has not even been returned to Earth. Phase 2 began 12 hours after Phase 1, exactly on schedule. It was called diplomatic isolation, and it was designed to do what the name suggested. Every human ambassador, attaché, trade representative, and liaison officer stationed in Council-affiliated space received the same coded message at the same time. Withdraw. Pack your files, seal your offices, wipe your databases, and leave. Do not explain, do not negotiate, do not respond to requests for clarification. Just go. I monitored the withdrawal from Relay Station Kappa. It was vast. Humanity had diplomatic presence on over 300 worlds and stations across Council space. We had trade offices in every major port. We had cultural liaisons in every capital. We had agricultural advisors, engineering consultants, medical researchers, and educational specialists embedded in dozens of institutions across 100 different planets. Every single one of those offices went dark within 18 hours. The withdrawal was clean, professional, and absolute. Our people packed their personal belongings, secured their classified materials, and walked out the door without a word. Some of them had been stationed at their posts for years. Some of them had built friendships, professional relationships, entire lives in the communities they served. They left it all behind because the order was clear and the reason was unambiguous. Some species barely noticed the departure. Others panicked. The Velhari commune, which had relied on a human trade liaison to mediate their shipping disputes for the past decade, sent 14 urgent messages to the Gallant Hawk in a single hour, each one more frantic than the last, begging for an explanation. I did not respond. The Chalori Republic, whose entire medical system had been restructured by human doctors over a 15-year partnership, watched helplessly as their human-trained surgical teams boarded transport ships and departed without offering replacements or transition plans. The Chalori health minister made a public plea for the doctors to return, calling them friends and colleagues and partners. It was sincere, and it was heartbreaking, and it changed nothing. Because friendship does not survive the murder of an ambassador. The Drellian Consortium, whose agricultural sector depended on human-engineered soil treatment processes, realized within hours that their next planting season was in jeopardy. Their farmers did not know how to maintain the systems without human technicians. Nobody had thought to learn, because the humans had always been there. The assumption had been that they always would be. That assumption died on the council floor alongside Lena. But here was the part that made Phase 2 more than just a withdrawal. While our ambassadors were leaving council space, a different set of communications was being sent through channels that the council did not know existed. Quiet ones, private frequencies. backdoors that our intelligence division had spent years cultivating. Earth's diplomatic corps had mapped the political landscape of the galaxy with a precision that would have shocked the Council if they had known about it. We knew which species were loyal to the Concord, we knew which ones resented it, and we knew which ones had been waiting for decades for someone to give them a reason to walk away. There were dozens of species that had never been given a vote in the Concord of 12. They sat in the observer galleries and watched the big powers make decisions that affected their worlds without any input from them. They paid tribute. They followed rules they had no role in writing. They were ignored, marginalized, and occasionally exploited. And they were angry about it, quietly and patiently, in the way that only powerless people can be angry. Earth reached out to every single one of them. The message was simple: bilateral trade agreements, direct partnerships, no council oversight, no tribute to the Concord, no middlemen taking a cut, just two species doing business on equal terms, with contracts drafted by mutual consent and disputes resolved by mutual agreement. 7 of them accepted within hours. 7 species that had been sitting on the margins of galactic civilization, watching the powerful play games with their futures, suddenly found themselves being offered the one thing the Council had never given them: respect. By the end of the second day, 14 more were in active negotiations. The Council's monopoly on interstellar governance, the system they had spent centuries building and defending, was beginning to fracture. And the most devastating part was that they had done it to themselves. They had killed the one human who had been trying to make their system work for everyone. On the evening of the second day, I received a private communication that changed the shape of everything that followed. It came through a back channel, encrypted with a cipher that only a handful of people in the galaxy knew existed. The sender was Trade Delegate Savi of the Keth Dominion. The Keth were one of the Council's mid-tier members, cautious by nature, careful in their alliances, and scrupulously honest in their dealings. Savi was their senior diplomatic representative, and I had met her twice during Lena's trade negotiations. She was sharp, patient, and disarmingly direct in a way that most Council politicians were not. She told me something that I had suspected, but had not been able to confirm. The Council vote on Lena's execution had not been unanimous. 4 species had opposed it. The Keth were one of them. They had argued that executing a diplomatic envoy was a violation of every principle the Council claimed to stand for. They had demanded a delay, a trial, a review, a hearing, anything but what happened. They had pointed out that the Galactic Diplomatic Immunity Act specifically prohibited the use of force against accredited envoys. They had cited precedent. They had quoted law. They had done everything right. Zithran had overruled them. Under Article 9 of the Concord, the High Arbiter held emergency judicial authority in cases of sovereign aggression. He did not need a majority vote. He only needed a quorum, and the quorum rules were written in a way that heavily favored the Arbiter's position. The 4 dissenting species had been outvoted before they could even finish their objections. The system that was supposed to prevent abuses of power had been designed, from the very beginning, to enable them. Savi told me she was sorry. She said it quietly, without ceremony or pretense, like someone who knew that the word was inadequate, but had nothing else to offer. She said she had tried. She said they had all tried. She said it had not been enough. Then she warned me about what was coming. Zithran was not backing down. He was doubling his position, framing humanity's economic withdrawal as proof that we had always been hostile. He was telling the Council that the execution was not just justified but necessary. He was rallying the military bloc, the species whose economies were built on weapons contracts and military spending, and he was preparing to mobilize the Council's combined fleet. I thanked Savi for the information. I told her that what she had done took courage, and that Earth would not forget it. Then I told her to move her people out of the Vela corridor, all of them. Civilians, merchants, diplomats, everyone. She paused. She asked me why. I told her that Phase 3 was not economic. There was a long silence on the channel. Then Savi said she understood, and the connection went dead. I sat alone in the briefing room for a long while after that conversation. I pulled up the deployment map on the holographic display and studied it. Earth's 7th and 9th combined fleets had completed mobilization. 400 warships, ranging from fast attack corvettes to heavy dreadnoughts, fully armed and fully crewed. They were not heading for Ithara Prime. A direct assault on the Council's capital would have been dramatic and satisfying, and profoundly stupid. It would have united every species against us, and turned the narrative from their crime into our aggression. Protocol 7 was smarter than that. The fleets were heading for every single military installation the Council operated along human borders. Simultaneously, 47 targets, 47 synchronized arrivals, the largest coordinated military deployment in human history, and it was about to land on the Council's doorstep. I checked the timestamp on my terminal. 53 hours since Lena died. The Council still had not issued an apology. They had not returned her body. They had not even acknowledged that what they did might have been wrong. They were too busy scrambling to save their trade networks and rally their warships. I closed the deployment map and opened a comm channel to Admiral Kessler. I requested a transfer to the 7th Fleet's command vessel. I wanted tactical authority over the border operations. She studied me through the screen for a long moment, measuring something in my face that I could not see myself. Then she approved the transfer without a single question. I packed my gear and left Relay Station Kappa within the hour. I transferred my flag to the Iron Meridian at 0400 hours on the 4th day. She was the 7th Fleet's command dreadnought, and she was everything the gallant Hawk was not. Where the Hawk was built for speed and diplomacy, the Iron Meridian was built for one purpose only. She was 3 kilometers long, armored with layered composite plating that could absorb a direct nuclear strike without buckling, and she carried enough firepower to crack a small moon in half. Her crew complement was 4,000, and every single one of them had watched the footage of Lena's execution. I could feel it in the air when I stepped aboard. The anger, the focus, the quiet, collective determination of people who knew exactly what they were here to do. I stood on the Iron Meridian's bridge and addressed the fleet via open channel. I told them what the mission was, and more importantly, what it was not. We were not going to the border to start a war. We were not going to wipe anything from the stars. Every Council military outpost along the human border was to be surrounded, disabled, and stripped of offensive capability. Their weapons would be neutralized. Their shields would be collapsed. Their crews would be disarmed, detained, and treated with full compliance under interstellar rules of engagement. They would be given food, water, and medical attention if needed. They would be released once Earth's terms were met. I made one thing absolutely clear. If anyone fired on us first, we would respond with proportional force. Not excessive, proportional. The galaxy was watching, and we were going to make sure that every species with a sensor array pointed in our direction could see the difference between what the Council had done and what we were doing. They had killed a woman holding a peace proposal. We were going to show them what it looked like when we were not holding one. Then I gave the order to move. The 7th and 9th fleets jumped simultaneously. 47 task forces, each consisting of between 6 and 15 ships, dropped out of hyperspace at their assigned targets within a 4-minute window. The coordination was flawless. It had to be. One missed timing, one early arrival, one station that managed to send a warning before its neighbors were engaged, and the entire operation would have unraveled. I narrated the operation from the Iron Meridian's command center, watching the tactical displays update in real time as each task force reported in. The Velar corridor was my primary area of responsibility. 12 Council battle stations guarded the corridor, each one bristling with weapons platforms and shielded by layered defense grids. They were formidable installations, designed and built to control access to one of the most strategically important regions in the galaxy. The Council had used them to block human expansion into the corridor for decades. They were the reason Lena had been sent to negotiate in the first place. They were the walls that had made diplomacy necessary. Our fleet arrived in staggered micro-jumps, a navigational technique that human pilots had perfected over 2 decades of practice, but that few other species could replicate with any consistency. Instead of dropping out of hyperspace in a single cluster, which would have given the stations time to raise shields and charge weapons. Our ships emerged in rapid sequence. Each vessel appeared at a precisely calculated position, closing the net around each station from multiple angles simultaneously. By the time the station commanders realized what was happening, they were already boxed in. Every firing lane was covered. Every escape vector was blocked. They were surrounded before they could even finish their threat assessment protocols. I gave the order for targeted electromagnetic pulse bursts. Our ships fired in unison, coordinated volleys that struck each station's weapons arrays and shield generators with surgical accuracy. The station's offensive systems went dark in seconds. Shields collapsed like soap bubbles. Targeting arrays went blind. Communication dishes stopped transmitting. The stations themselves remained intact, their hulls unbreached, their life support systems untouched, their artificial gravity still functioning. But every weapon they possessed was now dead metal, and every shield that had protected them was gone. Boarding teams launched from our carriers within minutes of the stations going dark. Marines in powered armor crossed the gap between our ships and the stations in pressurized shuttles, breached the outer airlocks using override codes that our intelligence division had obtained years ago, and moved through the corridors with calm, disciplined efficiency. They cleared each section methodically, securing weapons lockers, sealing armory doors, and directing station personnel toward assembly points. They met resistance in exactly 2 stations. In both cases, the resistance lasted less than 3 minutes. A handful of guards raised their weapons, and then immediately lowered them when they saw what they were facing. 60 human Marines in full combat armor, moving with a speed and coordination that made the station defenders look like children playing soldier. Nobody wanted to die for a station that had already lost its ability to fight back. The alien crews were disarmed and gathered in their mess halls, the largest open spaces on each station. Our Marines gave them water and ration packs and told them to sit tight. They were not prisoners of war. They were not hostages. They were station crews who had been caught up in a political crisis they did not create, and they would be released when it was over. Several of the officers were visibly terrified. I could see it on the body camera feeds that the boarding teams were transmitting back to the Iron Meridian. Wide eyes, trembling hands, the particular body language of beings who expected to die and could not quite believe they were still breathing. They had been told stories about humans. They had heard the warnings that the Council had been broadcasting for years about the Death World species that was too aggressive, too dangerous, too unpredictable to be trusted with real power. They had been told that if humans ever came with weapons, it would be the end. Instead, the humans who came with weapons were handing out food and checking their life support systems. One station's chief medical officer, a Palix female named Revith, approached the Marine squad leader and asked if she could continue treating her patients in the station's infirmary. She had 3 crew members recovering from minor surgical procedures, and she was afraid they would be separated from her care. The squad leader, a sergeant named Katie Marsh, told her to go right ahead and assigned 2 Marines to escort her, not as guards but as assistants, in case she needed anything moved or lifted. Revith stared at Marsh for a long moment with an expression I could not quite read. Then she turned and walked back to her infirmary, and the 2 Marines followed her like they were orderlies rather than occupiers. One of them, a young Thalari communications specialist, was shaking so badly that he could barely stand. He had flattened himself against a wall and was staring at the Marines like they were predators closing in for the kill. Corporal Danny Hayes, a Marine from the 3rd boarding team, noticed him. Hayes was 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, and wearing powered armor that made him look like a walking tank. He could have walked past the terrified alien without a second glance. Instead, he sat down on the floor next to him, popped open his helmet visor, and pulled out a ration pack. He opened it slowly, showing the Thalari the contents, and then ate a bite of the protein bar inside. Then he offered the pack to the alien. The Thalari stared at the food for a long time. Then he took a bite and stopped shaking. I received reports from the other 46 targets as the hours passed. The results were remarkably consistent across every engagement. Every station disabled, every crew detained. 0 fatalities on either side. 47 military installations, the entire backbone of the Council's border defense network, neutralized in less than 8 hours without a single death. Our Marines had fired over 12,000 electromagnetic pulse rounds and exactly 0 lethal ones. One of the captured station commanders requested to speak with me directly. His name was Keleth, a Vorathi senior officer, with gray-scaled skin and the kind of weary face that had seen enough politics to know when the ground was shifting beneath his feet. I granted the request via video link. Keleth studied me through the screen for a moment. Then he asked me if this was the Retaliation. I told him this was the polite version. He held my gaze without blinking, which took some courage given the circumstances. Then he asked what the impolite version looked like. I told him that he did not want to find out. Then I closed the channel. 12 hours into the operation, I received an intelligence briefing from Admiral Kessler. The Council had convened an emergency war session under Zithran's authority. The High Arbiter had declared humanity's border operation an act of unprovoked military aggression, which was a remarkable piece of rhetorical gymnastics, given that they had started the entire crisis by killing our ambassador. He ordered the Council's combined fleet to mobilize. 600 warships from 9 species were converging on the Vela corridor, with orders to crush the human incursion and liberate the captured stations. 600 ships. That was roughly 50% more than we had in the entire border deployment. Kessler asked me if I needed reinforcements. She could redirect the Third Fleet from its patrol route and have them in position within 36 hours. I told her no. I did not need reinforcements. I had something better. For the past 30 years, Earth had been running a program so classified that fewer than 200 people in the entire human government knew it existed. It was called the Sentinel Network. It was the reason Protocol 7 had a final phase, and it was about to change the balance of power in the galaxy permanently. Starting 3 decades ago, Earth's Deep Space Engineering Corps had begun seeding autonomous defense platforms along every major hyperspace corridor in Council space. The platforms were small, roughly the size of a standard shipping container, and they were designed from the ground up to be completely invisible to every detection system the galaxy had ever produced. Some were disguised as derelict satellites tumbling in empty orbits. Others were built into the hulls of abandoned mining rigs that nobody had visited in years. Others were hidden inside asteroid fields, powered down to absolute zero energy output, drawing nothing, emitting nothing, reflecting nothing. Thousands of them, spread across the galaxy like seeds buried in soil, dormant and patient, and waiting for a spring that we had prayed would never come. They had never been activated. In 30 years of silent deployment, not a single Sentinel platform had powered up. Not a single one had been detected by any species scanning technology, and not a single one had fired a shot. They were the ultimate insurance policy, the kind you buy hoping you will never need it, knowing that if the day comes when you do, nothing else will be enough. I sat down at my command terminal and opened the Sentinel Network activation interface. The screen displayed a single input field and a biometric scanner. Activation required 2 authorization codes entered simultaneously, one from me and one from Admiral Kessler. We had rehearsed this exactly once, during a classified simulation exercise that none of us had expected to use outside a training scenario. I looked at Kessler's face on the screen. She looked at mine. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The weight of what we were about to do hung between us like something solid. Then she nodded, and we entered our codes together. The Sentinel Network woke up. Across the galaxy, in hundreds of star systems, thousands of dormant platforms powered on for the first time in their existence. Their micro-reactors ignited, their targeting arrays came online, their weapons systems armed and calibrated, and every single one of them began broadcasting the same message on every frequency, in every language recognized by the Galactic Communications Standard. You are transiting through Earth-monitored space. Reduce speed and hold position, or you will be disabled. This is not a request. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Council's combined fleet was still 12 hours from the Velar corridor when 200 Sentinel platforms materialized directly in their flight path. They appeared from nothing, cold metal shapes that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, and they formed a wall across the hyperspace corridor that the fleet could not pass without fighting through. The fleet's commander, a Vorathi admiral named Dren, dropped his ships out of hyperspace and hailed me on an open channel. His voice was shaking, not with anger, with the kind of fear that comes from realizing that the universe is not arranged the way you thought it was. He demanded to know what the platforms were. He demanded to know how they had gotten there. He demanded an explanation. I responded on the same open channel, making sure every ship in his fleet and every listening post in the sector could hear every word. I told him they were insurance. I told him we had hoped we would never need them. I told him that his council had made sure we did. Then I closed the channel and let the silence do its work. Admiral Dren's fleet held position. 600 warships, the combined military power of 9 species, frozen in space by 200 platforms, and the dawning, terrible realization that they had absolutely no idea how many more were out there. The answer was thousands, but I did not tell them that. Not yet. The standoff lasted 9 hours, and every single one of them was a test of nerve that I felt in my bones. I spent those hours on the bridge of the Iron Meridian, monitoring power signatures from every ship in the Council fleet. 600 vessels, arranged in a defensive formation that told me their admiral was terrified. Dren had positioned his heaviest warships at the front, his carriers in the middle, and his support vessels at the rear. It was a textbook defense posture, designed to absorb a first strike and protect the vulnerable ships behind the wall. It was not an attack formation. He was expecting us to shoot first. I had no intention of shooting at all. The sentinel platforms held their positions like a wall of silent stone, weapons armed, targeting arrays locked on their assigned ships, broadcasting their warning message on a continuous loop. Every 30 seconds, every ship in the Council fleet heard the same words. Reduce speed and hold position, or you will be disabled. This is not a request. Meanwhile, Zithran was screaming on every open channel in the galaxy. He was calling the Sentinels an illegal weapons deployment, a violation of the Concord of 12, proof that humanity had always been planning an invasion. He was telling every species that would listen that Earth was the aggressor, that the Council was the victim, that the galaxy needed to unite against the human threat before it was too late. He was saying everything he could think of, except the one thing that mattered, which was that his council had murdered an unarmed diplomat and was now discovering what happened when the species they attacked stopped being diplomatic. I muted his channel after the first hour. The sound of a desperate man making excuses was not useful intelligence. The fractures began around the 3rd hour. The Keth Dominion was the first to break. Their ships, 12 light cruisers and 2 diplomatic escorts, powered down their weapons, broke formation, and transmitted a formal withdrawal notice to Admiral Dren. The notice stated that the Keth government no longer recognized the legitimacy of the Council's military action and was withdrawing from the combined fleet effective immediately. It cited the execution of Ambassador Castillo as a violation of galactic law and stated that the Keth would not participate in further military action until the matter was resolved through proper legal channels. Dren ordered them to hold position. They ignored him. Their ships turned away from the formation, opened a direct channel to the Iron Meridian, and requested safe passage. I granted it without hesitation. Trade Delegate Savi appeared on my screen. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her normally crisp uniform wrinkled, but her expression was set with the kind of resolve that comes from making a decision you know you cannot take back. She told me that the Keth government had voted to publicly denounce the execution and to demand the immediate removal of Zithran from his position. The vote had been unanimous. I thanked her. Then I asked her to hold her ships at a safe distance and wait. 20 minutes later, the Orani collective followed. Their contribution to the fleet was smaller, 8 destroyers and a handful of support ships, but their withdrawal carried weight that went far beyond numbers. The Orani were one of the Council's founding species. They had been part of the Concord since its inception, their signatures on the original charter. For them to pull out was not just a tactical decision, it was a declaration that the institution they had helped build was no longer worth defending in its current form. By the 5th hour, the Palix Federation had also withdrawn. Their admiral sent me a private message that I did not share with anyone at the time but have never forgotten. It said simply that they were ashamed of what was done in their name, and they would not compound the shame by firing on the people who had been wronged. 3 species gone, nearly 100 ships removed from the fleet. And the defections were having a cascading effect on the rest. The remaining council captains could see their coalition crumbling in real time on their tactical displays. They could see the ships pulling away, the formation thinning, the walls of their alliance developing cracks that no amount of Zithran's rhetoric could paper over. And all the while, the Sentinel platform sat in front of them, patient and armed, waiting for someone to make a mistake. I watched the diplomatic channels light up on my tactical display. Species that had been afraid to challenge the Council for centuries were suddenly finding their voices. The execution had cracked the dam, and humanity's response had blown it apart entirely. Grievances that had been suppressed for generations were pouring out across every diplomatic frequency. Trade disputes, territorial claims, accusations of exploitation, marginalization, and outright theft. The Numeri, a small species that had been forced to cede mining rights to the Vorathi decades ago, publicly demanded renegotiation. The Tessic, who had lost 2 colony worlds to a council territorial redistribution program that they had never been consulted about, announced that they were filing formal claims under the new framework that Earth was proposing. Even the Chalori, who had been so dependent on human medical expertise, began openly criticizing the Council's decision-making structure, arguing that a system that could authorize an execution without meaningful debate was a system that could authorize anything. The Council was not just facing a human adversary, it was facing the accumulated resentment of every species it had ever stepped on, every ignored petition, every unfair ruling, every trade deal that had been structured to benefit the powerful at the expense of the small. All of it was coming due at once, and the bill was enormous. Zithran could see it too. And cornered politicians do desperate things. At hour 7, he issued a direct order to Admiral Dren: attack the Sentinel Wall. Full fleet engagement, destroy the platforms, and proceed to the Velar corridor to relieve the captured stations. I was watching Dren's command ship when the order came through. I could not see his face, but I could see his ship's power readings spike as his crew began charging weapons and spinning up targeting systems. For 60 long seconds, nothing happened. The fleet sat in formation, weapons hot, shields at maximum, waiting for their admiral to relay the final command. Then Dren's voice came over the fleet channel. He sounded like a man walking toward a ledge. He ordered all remaining ships to advance and engage the Sentinel platforms. The ships moved forward as a single mass. 300 vessels, weapons armed, shields blazing, committed to an attack on a wall of platforms whose capabilities they did not understand. It was brave in a way. It was also exactly what I had been expecting. Protocol 7 had accounted for the possibility that the Council would choose to fight rather than back down. It had also accounted for the outcome. The Sentinel platforms did not wait for the fleet to close the distance. They moved first, accelerating from their static positions with a speed and coordination that no manned fleet could match. Autonomous systems operating at machine speed, making targeting decisions in microseconds, adjusting firing solutions in real time. As the enemy formation shifted, each platform selected a target, closed to engagement range in seconds, and fired a single precision burst at the target's engine assembly. The shots were surgical. No warheads, no explosives, no lethal force of any kind. Focused electromagnetic pulses, calibrated to the exact resonance frequency of each target ship's propulsion system, powerful enough to overload the drives without breaching the hull. One shot, one engine. The affected ships lurched as their drives sputtered and died, their forward momentum carrying them into slow, tumbling drifts. Ship after ship went dark. Weapons powered down as emergency systems kicked in, rerouting all available energy to life support and structural integrity. Communications arrays flickered and died. Running lights blinked out. From a distance, it looked like someone was turning off a string of lights, one by one, from left to right across the formation. I watched the tactical display update in real time, as each ship's status changed from hostile to disabled. Red icons turning gray, threat assessments dropping to 0. The most powerful fleet the Council had ever assembled was being dismantled with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon removing stitches. Some of the disabled ships drifted into each other, their dead hulls bumping and scraping in slow motion. Others tumbled end over end, their crews floating in zero gravity, as artificial gravity generators lost power, along with everything else. Emergency beacons activated automatically, tiny pulses of light calling for rescue from a fleet that no longer existed as a fighting force. Inside those ships, thousands of crew members were experiencing the most terrifying minutes of their lives, sitting in darkness, feeling their ships go dead around them, not knowing if the next sound they heard would be the hiss of a hull breach or the hum of boarding shuttles. They did not know that we had no intention of boarding them. We had made our point. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 300 warships drifted in the void, disabled but intact. Every crew alive, every hull unbreached, every life support system functioning. But not a single ship could move, shoot, or call for help. Zithran's flagship was the last to go dark. It was a massive vessel, the jewel of the Vorathi fleet, and the Sentinels had saved it for the end. The final platform closed to within 100 meters of the flagship's bridge viewport, close enough that Zithran could have looked out the glass and seen the weapon that was about to end his fleet's fight. Then it fired, and the flagship's engines died with a deep, structural shudder that I could read on my sensors from hundreds of kilometers away. I opened a channel to the flagship. There was a long silence. Emergency lighting hummed in the background. Frightened crew members murmured. The hull creaked with the slow, settling sounds of a ship adjusting to a dead drift. Then Zithran answered. His voice was different now. The measured, deliberate tone that had terrified diplomats for decades was gone. In its place was something raw, not fear, exactly, disbelief. He had been so certain of his position, so certain that the Council was the supreme authority in the galaxy, so certain that humanity was a minor species, useful for mining and engineering, but fundamentally beneath the dignity of the Concord. He had ordered Lena's execution because he believed Earth would file a protest and then kneel. He had never imagined this. I delivered Earth's terms. I spoke clearly and without emotion, because emotion was not what this moment required. What it required was the cold, surgical precision of language that could not be misunderstood. Full acknowledgement that the execution of Ambassador Lena Castillo was unlawful under the Council's own legal framework. A formal apology, broadcast to every species in the Council's communication network, without qualifiers, without excuses, and without any attempt to frame the execution as justified. Reparations to Ambassador Castillo's family, the amount to be determined by an independent tribunal, permanent human veto authority over any future council tribunal involving a sovereign species' citizens, to ensure that no single arbiter could ever again unilaterally order the killing of a diplomatic envoy, and finally, the immediate and permanent removal of High Arbiter Zithran from his position. Zithran listened to every word without interrupting. When I finished, there was another long silence. Then he said that he would rather die than submit to a Deathworld species. I told him that could be arranged, but unlike him, we would give him a trial first. The channel went dead. I sat back in my command chair and waited. The terms had been delivered. The fleet was disabled. The Sentinel network was active across half the galaxy. The economic blockade was grinding the Council's infrastructure into dust. A third of the Council's own members had defected. The remaining loyal members convened an emergency vote. I did not need to listen to the deliberations to know what the outcome would be. Without their fleet, without their trade networks, without the support of their own allies, the mathematics of their situation was inescapable. Mathematics does not negotiate, and power does not bluff when it has nothing left to bluff with. The result came through on my screen 18 hours after I delivered the terms. Zithran was removed from his position by a margin of 9-4. The 4 who voted to keep him were the same species that had built their entire economies around council patronage and had nowhere else to turn. Aldridge was standing beside me when the result appeared. She asked if it was over. I told her it was not over. It was just beginning. Removing Zithran was one step. What came next was the harder part. Building something that would make sure this could never happen again. I opened a private file on my terminal. The photo of Lena at her certification ceremony. That smile. That genuine, unguarded belief that the work she was about to do mattered. I closed the file and opened a new document. I started drafting the framework for what came next. A new galactic order. One built not on trust, because trust had failed spectacularly, but on accountability, transparency, and the understanding that power without constraint is just cruelty waiting for an excuse. I worked through the night. By morning, I had a first draft. It was rough, and it was incomplete, and it would need weeks of revision. But unlike Lena's proposal, This one would not be delivered by someone on their knees. 3 weeks after they killed Lena Castillo, I stood on the council floor at Athara Prime and looked at the spot where she had died. The scorch mark was still on the stone, a dark, irregular stain on pale marble, roughly the size of a dinner plate, burned into the floor where the weapon had discharged. The cleaning crews had been ordered not to touch it. That was part of the terms. I had insisted on it personally, and when several delegates objected, I had refused to explain my reasons. Some of them found it barbaric, a morbid display that served no diplomatic purpose. They were wrong about that. It served exactly one purpose. Every delegate who walked across that floor, every species that took their seat in this chamber, would see it. They would have to step around it or step over it. They would have to acknowledge every single day what this place had been used for. Plaques can be removed. Monuments can be torn down. Memorials can be forgotten. A scorch mark on the floor where someone died is something you cannot look away from. I wanted them to feel that discomfort. I wanted it to last. I was not there for ceremony. I was there because the Concord of Equals, the document that would replace the Concord of 12, was being signed that afternoon, and I had spent the last 3 weeks helping to draft every word of it. The process had been exhausting in ways that combat never was. 41 species at the negotiating table, each with their own priorities, their own historical grievances, their own vision of what the new galactic order should look like. Species that had been rivals for centuries were now sitting in the same room, arguing about trade tariffs and tribunal composition and the precise legal language that would govern the use of force. Earth's negotiating team had worked around the clock, drafting and redrafting clauses, mediating disputes between delegations that refused to be in the same room without a neutral party present, and pushing back against every single attempt to water down the core reforms. The key provisions were non-negotiable. No species would hold permanent arbiter authority. Leadership of the new council would rotate on a fixed schedule, with each term limited to 4 standard years. No consecutive terms. No emergency extensions. No exceptions. Tribunal sentences against any sovereign citizen would require unanimous consent from all member species, not a simple majority, not a quorum, unanimous consent, plus an independent judicial review conducted by a panel with no political affiliation to the Council or any of its member species. And Article 9, the execution clause of the Old Concord, was abolished entirely and permanently. No tribunal, no arbiter, no vote could ever again authorize the killing of a diplomatic envoy. I watched the signing ceremony from a seat near the back of the chamber. I had been offered a position at the front, next to Earth's new diplomatic delegation, but I had declined. This was not my moment. I was a military officer who had been given the tools to create the conditions for this ceremony. Now that it was happening, my job was to watch, not to perform. The delegates came forward one by one to place their species seal on the document. Some signed eagerly. These were mostly the smaller species, the ones who had spent decades in the observer galleries, watching decisions being made about their futures without their input. The Keth Dominion's representative signed with quiet dignity, placing her seal precisely in the center of the designated space. The Palix Federation's delegate made a short speech about the cost of silence and the value of accountability. 7 species that had never before been full members of any galactic body signed with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming experience of being treated as equals for the first time. Others signed through gritted teeth. The Vorathi representative looked physically ill, his gray scales flushed dark with what I assumed was either anger or humiliation. The Drellian ambassador hesitated, with his seal hovering over the document for nearly 10 seconds, long enough that the chamber began to murmur, before pressing it down with visible reluctance. These were the species that had built their power on the old system, the ones who had enjoyed outsized influence and were now being forced to share it with species they had spent centuries looking down on. I noted each reaction without comment. I had learned something important in the past 3 weeks, something that Lena had probably understood long before I did. Diplomacy was not about making everyone happy. It was about building a structure that could survive, even when people were unhappy. The old Concord had failed, because it concentrated power in the hands of a few and gave them no accountability, no checks, no consequences for abuse. It had been designed by the powerful for the powerful, and it had functioned exactly as designed right up until the moment it destroyed itself. The new Concorde was different. It distributed power deliberately, creating enough checks and balances and oversight mechanisms that no single species could ever again do what Zithran had done. Every decision of consequence required multiple layers of review. Every exercise of authority left a documented trail. Every use of force required justification that could be challenged, examined, and, if necessary, reversed. It was bureaucratic and slow and frustrating by design, because the alternative was efficiency in the service of cruelty. And we had all seen where that led. It was not perfect. No system designed by 41 competing interests could ever be perfect. But it was better. Measurably, structurally, fundamentally better. And in this moment, better was enough. Zithran's trial took place in a separate chamber, 3 floors below the council hall. I attended as an observer, sitting in the back row of the gallery, watching the proceedings without participating. Earth had been deliberate about the composition of the tribunal. The judges were drawn from species that had not been part of the original council, specifically to avoid any appearance of bias or political motivation. 2 were from species that had joined the galactic community within the last 50 years. 1 was from a species so geographically remote that they had no political ties to any council faction and no economic interests that could be leveraged. The trial lasted 6 days. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. The full broadcast footage of Lena's execution, viewed frame by frame, with expert analysis of the guards' movements that proved the arrest had been rehearsed. The communications logs showing that Zithran had ordered the tribunal guards to prepare for the arrest 3 days before Lena even arrived at Ethara Prime, proving that the entire trade negotiation had been a trap. Testimony from council delegates who had opposed the execution and been overruled. Legal analysis from 5 independent scholars demonstrating that even under the old Concorde's most aggressive interpretation, the execution had violated multiple procedural requirements that Zithran had deliberately bypassed. Zithran's defense was predictable. His attorneys argued that humanity's expansion into the Velar corridor had constituted a genuine security threat, and that his actions fell within the emergency provisions of the Concorde. They presented intelligence reports suggesting that human military activity in the corridor was increasing. They argued that Lena's trade proposal was a diplomatic smokescreen designed to distract the Council while Earth consolidated its territorial gains. The tribunal reviewed the intelligence reports and found them inconclusive at best and fabricated at worst. More importantly, the judges found that even if every word of the reports had been accurate, the proper response under the Concorde would have been a formal investigation, followed by a diplomatic hearing, not a summary execution on the council floor without trial, without defense, without even the basic dignity of hearing the accused respond to the charges. Zithran had skipped every procedural step. He had not investigated. He had not warned. He had not negotiated. He had simply ordered a woman killed and expected the galaxy to nod along. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was permanent exile to a monitored colony world. Not death, not a cell. Exile, with regular welfare checks and basic amenities, on a planet where he would live out his remaining years without the ability to influence galactic politics ever again. He would have a house, a garden, access to literature and entertainment. He would lack for nothing material. He would simply be removed from the game he had played so badly, placed on a shelf where he could do no more damage. When the sentence was read aloud, Zithran stood perfectly still. He did not protest. He did not rage. He simply stood there, looking at the judges with an expression that might have been contempt, or might have been the beginning of understanding. I could not tell, and I did not much care. What mattered was that the system worked. The process was clean. The outcome was documented and defensible and transparent. A reporter from the Galactic Press Syndicate approached me after the sentencing. She asked why Earth had not pushed for execution. It was a fair question. Many people, human and alien, had been calling for it. There were voices on Earth arguing that anything less than death was insufficient justice for what had been done. I told the reporter that we were not them. That was the whole point. If we had executed Zithran, we would have become exactly what he accused us of being, another species that solved problems by killing the people it disagreed with. We would have won the immediate battle and lost the larger argument. The argument was not about Zithran. It was about what kind of galaxy we wanted to live in. And the galaxy we wanted was one where you did not kill people for political convenience, even when they might deserve it, even when the anger in your chest was telling you that it was justified. The reporter asked if I personally thought he deserved it. I told her that what I thought did not matter. What mattered was what we did. And what we did was give him a trial, hear his defense, weigh the evidence, and deliver a proportional sentence through a transparent judicial process. That was the difference between us and him. He had skipped every one of those steps. It had cost him everything. The Sentinel network was the next problem I had to address, and it was, in many ways, the most complicated challenge I faced during the entire crisis. The network had worked. Without the Sentinels, the Council fleet would have reached the Velar corridor, and we would have been fighting a conventional war against a force that outnumbered us significantly. The Sentinels had prevented that scenario by demonstrating, in 11 minutes of precise, non-lethal force, that humanity had the capability to disable any fleet in the galaxy without killing a single crew member. They had been the perfect deterrent, and they had performed exactly as designed. But now that the crisis was resolved, their existence raised questions that had no easy answers. Several species, including some of our strongest new allies, were deeply uncomfortable with the revelation that thousands of hidden weapons platforms had been sitting in their space for 30 years without their knowledge or consent. The Keth, who had been among the first to support us during the standoff, sent a formal diplomatic note expressing their concerns. If humanity could hide weapons throughout the galaxy without detection, what stopped another species from doing the same? What stopped us from using the network for offensive purposes in the future? Trust was one thing, verification was another. I was appointed to the committee that would decide the network's future. The debate within our own ranks was fierce. Some of my colleagues argued for keeping the entire network active and classified. They said it was the only guarantee of our security in a galaxy that had just shown us how quickly allies could become executioners. Others argued for full deactivation and disclosure, saying that maintaining a hidden weapons grid undermined every principle we were trying to build the new Concord on. I argued for a middle path, and after 2 weeks of intense deliberation, the committee adopted my proposal. Earth would permanently deactivate 70% of the Sentinel platforms. Their locations would be published openly, and any species would be permitted to send inspection teams to verify that they were genuinely powered down and inert. The remaining 30% would be converted into a shared early warning defense grid, jointly managed by Earth and the new Council. Their positions would be published. Their targeting protocols would be transparent and auditable. Any activation would require dual authorization from both human and Council security representatives, ensuring that no single species could use them unilaterally. It was a compromise, and like all compromises, it left everyone somewhat dissatisfied. But it achieved something that I believed was more valuable than any individual tactical advantage. It turned a unilateral weapon into a shared resource. It demonstrated that humanity was willing to surrender a significant strategic asset in exchange for collective security, and it sent a message to every species in the galaxy that we meant what we said about accountability and transparency. I noted privately that the 30% we kept active were still more than enough to respond to any future aggression, but I did not mention that in the committee meetings. Some truths serve everyone better when they remain unspoken. The memorial was unveiled on the 22nd day after Lena's death. It was placed on the council floor, on the exact spot where she had been killed. The scorch mark was preserved beneath it, sealed under a panel of transparent crystalline stone that allowed it to remain permanently visible. The memorial itself was simple, a low pedestal of dark granite, polished smooth, bearing her name, her diplomatic credentials, and a single passage from the trade proposal she had been reading when the guards seized her. The passage was about shared prosperity, about species working together, not because they were forced to, but because the galaxy was large enough for everyone, and the resources were abundant enough to make competition unnecessary. She had written those words herself, in her own hand, without help from speechwriters or policy advisors. The language was plain, the ideas were clear, and the belief behind them was so genuine that it almost hurt to read. I attended the unveiling ceremony. I stood at the back of the chamber, in the same spot I had occupied during the Concord signing, and I watched as Earth's new ambassador read the passage aloud. The chamber was full. Every species that had signed the Concord of Equals was represented. Some of them looked moved. Some of them looked uncomfortable. A few of them glanced down at the scorch mark visible beneath the transparent stone, and quickly looked away again. I did not speak. I had been asked to say a few words at the ceremony, and I had politely declined. What I had to say to Lena was not something I was willing to share with a room full of politicians, no matter how well-meaning they might be. After the ceremony ended, and the chamber emptied out, I stayed behind. The lights dimmed to their evening setting, casting long shadows across the marble floor. I stood alone next to the memorial and opened Lena's full trade proposal on my personal terminal. I had never read the entire document before. During her negotiations, my role had been security, not policy. I had protected her, escorted her, stood outside closed doors while she argued for ideas I barely understood. I had known she was brilliant, I had known the proposal was important, but I had never sat down and read every word. Now I did. It took me almost an hour. The proposal was extraordinary. It laid out a comprehensive framework for economic cooperation that would have benefited every species in the Council. It offered favorable trade terms to developing species, reduced tariffs on essential goods, created a dispute resolution mechanism that was fair and transparent and legally binding, and established a technology sharing program that would have accelerated development across the entire galactic community. The economic modeling alone was elegant, projecting increased trade revenue, reduced military spending, greater political stability, and improved quality of life across participating worlds. The Council would have benefited enormously from accepting it. Every single species, including the ones that had voted to kill her, would have seen their economies grow, their conflicts diminish, and their citizens prosper. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most generous diplomatic offers in galactic history, and they had killed the woman who brought it to them, because accepting it would have meant admitting that a Death World species had something valuable to offer. Because admitting that would have meant acknowledging that they were not as superior as they believed, because Zithran's pride was worth more to him than the prosperity of the galaxy he claimed to lead. I closed the terminal and stood in the empty chamber for a long time, looking at the scorch mark beneath the stone and the name carved above it. Then I left. The Iron Meridian was waiting in orbit. I took a shuttle up from the surface, docked at the command hangar, and walked through corridors that felt different from the ship I had boarded 3 weeks ago. The crew was quieter now, not subdued, just settled. The hard, fast-burning urgency of the crisis had given way to something steadier. They knew the fighting was done. They also knew that what came next would take longer and demand more patience than anything that had come before. I went to my quarters and found a message waiting on my terminal. Admiral Kessler was offering me a new position, head of Earth's newly created Interstellar Security Directorate. The role would oversee the Sentinel network transition, coordinate with the new Council's security apparatus, manage intelligence sharing between human and allied species, and ensure that the reforms we had fought for were actually implemented in practice rather than just on paper. It was the most important position in the human military. It was also the one I was least suited for by temperament. It would mean leaving the Iron Meridian, leaving Fleet Command, leaving the bridge, and the stars and the clean simplicity of military operations. It would mean spending the rest of my career in conference rooms, negotiating protocols, reviewing intelligence reports, and navigating political currents that I could barely see. It would mean becoming a bureaucrat in a uniform, and every instinct I had resisted the idea. But it would also mean finishing what Lena started. She had believed that the galaxy could be better. She had been wrong about the method, because diplomacy alone had not been enough. But she had been absolutely right about the goal. The galaxy could be better. It just needed a framework strong enough to survive the worst impulses of its members. That framework existed now, signed by 41 species, ratified by their governments, implemented by their institutions. But paper agreements were only as strong as the people who enforced them. Someone had to make sure the new Concord survived its first decade, its first crisis, its first test. Someone had to stand at the intersection of military power and diplomatic restraint, and make decisions that honored both. I sat with the offer for a long time. My comms officer pinged me with a routine update. A new diplomatic envoy had been appointed to replace Lena. Her name was Priya Dar. She was 31 years old, a mid-level trade negotiator from the coalition's commerce ministry. She had not been a public figure. She had not made speeches or won awards. She was the kind of quiet, competent professional who built things behind the scenes while others took the credit. She had requested the posting, not been assigned, not been ordered. She had walked into the appointments office and volunteered. She wanted to finish what Lena had started. She wanted to take the trade proposal, the same document that Lena had been reading when the guards grabbed her, revise it for the new political landscape, and bring it back to the table. Not as a gesture, not as a memorial, as policy, as the practical next step toward the galaxy that Lena had believed was possible. My comms officer added one more detail. Dar had requested a security briefing with the fleet commander before departing for her first assignment. She wanted to understand the military situation, the Sentinel network, the new council's security posture, and the specific risks she would face at every stop on her itinerary. She did not want to go in blind the way Lena had. She wanted to know where the threats were, who the allies were, what the contingency plans looked like. She was not naive. She knew what had happened to her predecessor. She was choosing to go anyway, but she was choosing to go prepared. I sat in my quarters and stared out the viewport for a long time. The stars were the same as they had always been. Cold, distant, utterly indifferent to the small, furious dramas of the species that lived among them. Out there, on 41 different worlds, governments were explaining the new Concord to their citizens. On Earth, people were grappling with the revelation that their government had hidden thousands of weapons platforms across the galaxy without telling them. On a monitored colony world, Zithran was beginning his exile, surrounded by guards and silence, and the weight of everything he had destroyed. And on Ethara Prime, a scorch mark on a marble floor, was slowly becoming the most visited site on the planet, a place where beings from dozens of species came to stand in silence and remember the cost of unchecked power. I had heard that visitors sometimes left small tokens beside the memorial. Stones, written notes, flowers from their home worlds. The council's custodial staff had been instructed to leave everything in place for 24 hours before clearing it, and every morning there were more offerings than the day before. Lena would have been embarrassed by the attention. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had just wanted to help people trade with each other fairly. The galaxy had decided to make her something larger, and I suppose that was the galaxy's right, even if it felt like a poor substitute for the woman herself. I opened the comm channel to Admiral Kessler and accepted the promotion. Then I composed a brief message to Priya Dar. I told her to contact me on my private frequency when she was ready for her briefing. I told her I would give her everything she needed, a full assessment of the security landscape, introductions to every military and diplomatic contact worth knowing, a complete picture of the risks, the allies, the species that could be trusted, and the ones that could not. And I told her that this time, I would not be waiting in orbit.